beautiful song based on one of Paul's great testimonies, Galatians 2:20. I've been crucified with Christ. Nevertheless I live, yet not I, but Christ lives in me. And this life which I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. I love the rain this morning. Maybe that's because I'm a dumb farm kid from Minnesota. And we've had a dry summer. And every time I go down to the farmer's market and I talk with the people at Vissers, I talk with them and they say, yeah, it's been a good season, but we could use more rain. When I was teaching in Nigeria, anytime the rains began to come after the dry season, the first rains would threaten, but they wouldn't come, they wouldn't fall, the thunder would happen, the lightning would sometimes flash in the skies, but the rains wouldn't come. And then the first rain on a metal roof. And the principal of the Reformed Theological College of Nigeria would say, we must stop. We must stop and we must rise and we must sing. There shall be showers of blessings. It was the missionaries that said, this is what we must do when the rains have returned once again. And it was a beautiful thing. I grew up on a farm, and farming is a very wonderful occupation for other people. Not that I don't like it. I really enjoy seeing things grow. But my grandmother used to say, when she saw me, you will see me at times like this, with my hands in my pockets. And she used to say to me, you're just like your dad. She said, Grandpa used to say, that kid's good for nothing. But I said, no, when he's got his hands in his pocket, there's a lot going on upstairs. You're just like your dad. So I'm hoping that even though I don't farm in the same way any longer, I still continue to think great thoughts like farmers always do. And I'm thinking about that today as we're looking at this particular passage of Scripture in John chapter 10, 11 as well. I'm thinking about growing up on a farm, and we had lots of different animals. But every now and again, we'd take a drive west, and we'd go out into South Dakota. And we'd get into South Dakota, and there were sheep running around on some of the hills. And I always thought the people in South Dakota had a much easier time than we did on the farm. We had so much we had to do. If you were a shepherd, you could just go out there and watch the sheep roam. Not too much business going on. I don't think it was exactly that way, but Jesus talks about being a shepherd, and he reminds us of the agricultural background that was very much a part of the Israelite and Jewish communities. In chapter 10, these very familiar words, I tell you the truth, the man who does not enter the sheep pen but by the gate, but climbs by some other way, is a thief and a robber. The man who enters by the gate is the shepherd of his sheep. The watchman opens the gate for him, and the sheep listen to his voice. He calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. When he has brought out all his own, he goes ahead of them, and his sheep follow him because they know his voice. But they will never follow a stranger. In fact, they will run away from him because they do not recognize a stranger's voice. Jesus used this figure of speech, but they did not understand what he was telling them. Therefore, Jesus said again, I tell you the truth, I am the gate for the sheep. All whoever came before me were thieves and robbers, but the sheep did not listen to them. I am the gate. Whoever enters through me will be saved. He will come in and go out and find pasture. The thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. I have come that they may have life and have it to the full. I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. The hired hand is not the shepherd who owns the sheep, so when he sees the wolf coming, he abandons the sheep and runs away. Then the wolf attacks the flock and scatters it. The man runs away because he is a hired hand and cares nothing for the sheep. I am the good shepherd. I know my sheep, and my sheep know me, just as my Father knows me, and I know the Father. And I lay down my life for the sheep. I have other sheep that are not of this sheepfold. I must bring them also. They too will listen to my voice. There shall be one flock and one shepherd. The reason my Father loves me is that I lay down my life, only to take it up again. No one takes it from me, but I lay it down of my own accord. I have authority to lay it down and authority to take it up again. This command I received from my Father. At these words, the Jews were again divided. Many of them said, "He's demon-possessed and raving mad. Why listen to him?" But others said, "These are not the sayings of a man possessed by a demon. Can a demon open the eyes of the blind?" They're making reference to what happened just before this in John chapter 9, where Jesus opened the eyes of the blind. Now, Jesus is talking about shepherds, and they come off looking pretty good. But that wasn't the case in the world of Jesus' day. By that time, shepherds were not held in high esteem. I don't know where you are in the social rankings. You probably wish you were higher and fear you might be lower than you think. Shepherds were always at the bottom. You could always be better than shepherds. By the time of Jesus, the rabbis were professing that there were 5 occupations that no observant Jew should ever practice. Bottom of the list or top of the list, bottom of the ranking, shepherds. What? That seems a little strange. But it does throw light on something in Luke's gospel. Remember that when Jesus was born, the first people who heard the news about Jesus were shepherds. For to you is born this day in the city of David a Savior who is Christ the Lord. Why to shepherds? They were the lost and the last and the least. Shepherds had grown out of favor in society since the times of David and of Abraham himself and Isaac and Jacob and Joseph and his brothers. They were all shepherds back then. But now they were civilized, right? They had moved into the promised land, then they'd been taken out of the promised land, and then they had returned to the promised land, and they had built their homes, and they had made nice houses and communities and safe fences to protect from sheep running across my lawn. Because sheep and shepherds didn't like boundaries. Not only that, they would often leave little offerings behind, which people didn't always appreciate and which caused people to become ritually impure. Shepherds were known to be ritually impure all the time. They could not go into the temple at all. There were bouncers at the door who said, check your badge, you a shepherd? Out of here. They were not allowed to make testimony in courts of law. They were considered to be liars and thieves. They could not be trusted or appreciated. That was the shepherds in Jesus' day. There was a song going around. I think Willie Nelson had already been there. Mamas, don't let your babies grow up to be shepherds. Something along those lines. The song went at that time. And Jesus seems to be reclaiming that. You can almost see the heads nodding in the crowd around Jesus as he's picking up this old profession and restoring it and making it new again. Yeah, that's what a shepherd should be. And then Jesus adds something to the mix that begins to hurt a few people because he uses words that were written way back when, well, by God, Jesus is God, but through the prophet Ezekiel in the Old Testament. Ezekiel was a son of a priest who was supposed to become a priest. He was supposed to go through a 5-year training session beginning when he was 25 years old. But that happened to be 597 BC. He didn't know that because people in those days didn't count time backwards like we do. But it was 597 BC, and he didn't get to go to school to become a priest. Why? Because the Babylonian army came through because the government was not paying the tariffs. And they laid siege to Jerusalem, and then they stole away some of the brightest and best of those who were in the ranks of the leaders of the community, including the sons of priests, and Ezekiel was one of those. He was taken over to Babylon, sort of under house arrest, kind of as a way of putting the screws to these people, saying, you better pay up or else. And now he was kind of twiddling his hands there out in Babylon, wondering what he was supposed to do with his life now that he couldn't be in the temple with his dad and with his cousins and with his uncles and be a priest there. And suddenly, when he was 30 years old, the age at which he should have been ordained as a priest, God came to him over there in Babylon, wham! And for 20 years, he started having visions. He began to see things that were still to come, things that were going to happen in Jerusalem, even the destruction of Jerusalem, and lots of other things. And he was really a good children's message teacher. He has lots of show and tell. But there was one thing, Ezekiel chapter 34. God comes to Ezekiel, and he's looking down from his perspective and seeing the struggles of the community, the people he loves. And the voice of God comes to and through Ezekiel. Things are going so badly down there because the leaders are destroying the people. They're tearing the community apart, and they are not providing the glue, the strength that holds the community together. And God, through Ezekiel, says, I will have to come down myself, and there will be one flock and one shepherd. You heard the words, right? Jesus is saying them again in this passage. And you know who else is hearing those words? The people themselves are saying, wow, that's quite something. But who's really hearing this? It's the leaders of the people, because exactly as it had happened with ancient Israel, it was happening again. There was a sense that the leaders themselves were not doing what they were supposed to be doing. And you can see it at the end of this. They start conniving in order to do something very horrible to Jesus. One family that went to Israel in order to take way too many photos so that they could bore all of their friends when they got back with the many pictures on their phones. They saw this photo op next to the road. There was a flock of sheep, and there was a guy. The shepherd and the sheep. Wow, this is cool. So they got their cameras out and were taking pictures. Problem is, every time the man moved, the sheep moved further away. And so one guy says, hey, what's going on out there? We thought the sheep were supposed to follow the shepherd. He yells back, that may be, but I'm the butcher. And indeed, the sheep know when the butcher comes. That's what Jesus says here too. And Jesus says that the sheep follow him because they know their master's voice. They hear a voice that calls, a voice that soothes, a voice that comforts, a voice that gives direction. They come and follow because this is an attractive voice. They can trust the one who speaks to them. In fact, Jesus says another strange thing there. He says, I have other sheep that are not from this particular pen, and I must go and I must do something with them as well. And here's where the whole thing begins to just explode with meaning. Why? Well, it's important for us to understand what's happening within the Gospel of John as Jesus' good buddy, best friend on earth. John tells the story of his friend Jesus. The other Gospels tell us that Jesus came with power, with authority, and did many miracles. How many? More than a dozen, more than 100, probably more than 1,000, could be more than 10,000. And the other Gospels, Mark, Matthew, and Luke, they all tell us of many, many miracles that Jesus did over and over again. John tells us that too. At the end, chapter 20, chapter 21, a couple of times he tells us, Jesus did many more miracles than these, but these are written that what? You may know, you may believe that he is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life in his name. So how many miracles does John tell us that Jesus did? This is quiz time, and you can all fill out your answers here. They'll be graded next week. Anybody know? 7. There are only 7 miracles recorded by John in his gospel. 8 if you jump ahead to the one in chapter 21, but 7 between the time that Jesus shows up and starts teaching until he dies. But the miracles that Jesus does, John calls them miraculous signs. They're kind of like these screens. They jump out at you. They not only happen in front of you, but then behind there's this flashing sign that says, do you get it? Do you get it? Do you get it? So what are the 7 signs, 7 miraculous signs that Jesus does? And here's where we get into some really interesting territory. The first sign that Jesus does is he comes to a party and he helps the people get drunk. Right? You know this, right? Chapter 2, Joseph is dead, Mary is poor, and distant relatives are getting married. And because there are no catering businesses, destination weddings, they ask Mary to come in, and she's supposed to provide the food and organize the thing, and then she's supposed to look after things until the guests are all gone. She can't do that on her own, so she takes her right-hand man, her son Jesus. Chapter 2. And the thing happens, the wedding happens. And then the guests become a little bit like distant relatives who don't know when to leave. And the thing lingers on, and they run out of supplies, including wine. And they come to Mary and they say, "Where's the wine?" And Mary says, "Go talk to Jesus." So they go talk to Jesus, and Jesus says, you see those stone basins there by the door? You know, everybody walks in those days. They still didn't have their driver's licenses, so everybody walked. And they come inside, and their feet are dusty from the roads, so they wash their feet, and then they dry them, and then they're allowed to be inside. Just dump the water out of there and put some other water in there, and then take a cup and go serve it to the bride's father. What? What do you think you're doing here? But he says it with such a commanding authority that they go do that. And then suddenly, whoa! Word comes back from the father of the bride. No, most people, when they throw a party, they start out with the good wine, because after a little while, people drink too much of it and they don't know what else is going on, and then you can serve them anything. But you've saved the best wine until now. Wow! And this is supposed to help us understand who Jesus is? Think of it next time you throw a party. What's going on? But John is very deliberate. John is very deliberate. What's going on? How does John start his gospel? He has a completely original thought. In the beginning. Wait a minute, that's not a completely original thought. Actually, the Bible starts out that way, in the beginning. And if you look at the opening lines of John's gospel, what happens is that everything is paralleled, right? First thing God creates at the beginning of time, and let there be light. And what does John talk about? And the light was created by God, and that light was the life of all people. And Jesus is that light. And there are creatures, they're walking in darkness, but Jesus is the light, and if they believe in him, they become children of God. What does Genesis say? We are made in his image, like children. You see how John is paralleling these things? And then what happens in Genesis? What's the first place that the pandemic, the great pandemic, not the little one of recent years, the great pandemic, where's the first place that the great pandemic strikes? It's that pandemic of sin that turns humans into zombies till they don't know who they are anymore or what they're about. And how does it affect the human race? We read in Genesis that Eve and Adam started accusing each other and hiding from one another, and the marriage is coming undone. Oh. Now do you get the first sign that Jesus is doing this miraculous sign? The first place that Jesus comes with his healing grace is to a marriage that's just getting started, and we all know how this thing's going to end. They may be happy today, but it ain't going to last. And Jesus brings back the party to the marriage. Now, you may think I'm pushing that, but what's the second major place in Genesis where the pandemic of sin begins to strike? Well, that horrible story where the first parents had children and one of them died horribly. You know the story. What's the second miraculous story in John's gospel? The nobleman. Nobleman. What ethnicity were Adam and Eve? Probably Dutch, but we don't know for sure. No. Adam and Eve preceded ethnicities. What you find in the Gospel of John is that every single person is identified by ethnicity except for one, this nobleman. And what happens to this nobleman? His son dies. And Jesus brings his son back to life. This is getting interesting, isn't it? Move it along. Third sign. We're at a pool on the north side of Jerusalem. There's this legend that sometimes God sends an angel down and the waters start to tremble and glow. First person in gets healed. There's been a guy who's been there for a long time. How long has he been there? Many years. How many years? Lots of years. All his adult life. No, very specifically, 38 years. 38 years. If you take away all of the chapter and verse references, the numbers we have put into the text of the Bible, take those all out so you don't look at those. How many times does the number 38 appear in the entire Bible? Only twice. Only here. The man has been waiting for 38 years in order to find the water troubled and be healed. Where's the other time? Deuteronomy 2, verse 14. Moses is giving his last address to Israel. He's 120 years old and he's going to die here. The Israelites, under Joshua's lead, will go into the promised land. How will they get into the promised land? Through the waters that need to be troubled by an angel. And what does Moses say? Deuteronomy 2, verse 14. These 38 years you've wandered in the wilderness. Are you ready to go into the promised land? Isn't this something? John gives us 7 miraculous signs, and through them he marks the history of ancient Israel, the movement of the pandemic, and the demise of human society, until we become not children of light, but children of darkness, until we become not living daughters and sons of the Most High, but zombies who are under the puppet control of the evil one. And we could go through all of those, but we won't today. But we get along the way, and we've just seen in chapter 9, if we can look back at that, the blind man's eyes being opened. Do you know how many times blind people received sight in the Old Testament? Exactly 0. But the prophet said when Messiah comes, he will open the eyes of the blind. And then there's one more thing that happens here, and it's just on the verge of it as we move ahead from John 9 into John 10. By the end of chapter 10 and chapter 11, by the end of chapter 10 and then into chapter 11, Jesus' good friend Lazarus gets sick. Jesus is up north in Galilee. Lazarus lives in a suburb of Jerusalem called Bethany. And Jesus has visited there regularly, stayed. Lazarus has 2 sisters, Mary and Martha, good friends of Jesus. Jesus gets the message that Lazarus is sick. Well, Jesus has healed other sick people, so here's the time, Jesus, okay? You did it for people you didn't know. Let's do it for the guy you really love. And what does Jesus do? He sits up north and he twiddles his thumbs and he fills out a couple more crossword puzzles and Sudokus and doesn't do anything about it until suddenly new word comes several days later that Lazarus has died. Lazarus has died. Oh no, Jesus, you could have done something about this. Why didn't you do anything about it? And now suddenly Jesus gets all concerned. He says, I better go. It's time. And the disciples say, no, you can't do anything anymore. He's dead. And Jesus says, but I've got to go. And they say, but they're going to do some bad things to you there. You might die. In fact, Thomas, the one who's called the doubter, he shrugs his shoulders and says, men, let's go with him and die. And so they go. They go. By the time they get close to Bethany, Martha hears about Jesus coming. She runs out of the house. She runs up the road. She takes her fist and she pounds them into Jesus' chest. She says, if you had been here, my brother wouldn't have had to die. And he puts his arm around her and they walk on. Jesus gets closer to Bethany, and then suddenly Mary gets up from her mourning, steals out of the house, comes close to him and says, if you had been here, my brother wouldn't have had to die. They go on to the cemetery. And they get to the cemetery. And they stand there in the land of the living, next to the house of the dead, in safety. And Jesus says, roll the stone away. And they say, no, you don't want to do that. Jesus says, roll the stone away. No, you don't understand. He stinks. Jesus says, roll the stone away. And they roll the stone away. Now, what was it Jesus had said? My sheep know my voice, and I call them, and they come and follow me. And from here in the land of the living, with a loud voice, Jesus says, Lazarus! And down, 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 in the depths of death, where the baddest of the bad shepherds has stolen away his good friend Lazarus. Lazarus hears a familiar voice, and he comes, and he lives, and he follows his good shepherd. It was just over a year ago that our 6-year-old grandson died. I've buried my parents. I've had many funerals. I wish I hadn't, but I have. And for some reason, I'm beginning to think that I may not live forever. There was a time when I believed that. But for a 6-year-old to die of neuroblastoma, that was particularly hard. He came through, 3 years old, he was diagnosed, came through 16 rounds of chemotherapy, 12 rounds of radiation. Shouldn't happen to anybody, whatever your age. 80% fatality rate. He lived. It was a miracle. 3 times over, the doctors declared him free of cancer. Treatments had done a number on his body. And then the pains came. And just like that, wham! The horrible thing was back. And those nasty other shepherds they took the life of my daughter's child. They took the life of my grandson, 6 years old. Shortly before he died, he loved the out of doors. He was too weak to stand any longer, so sometimes they'd take a blanket and put it on the lawn, lay him on his back there, and he'd look up at the skies and watch the shape of the clouds. And he asked our daughter, his mom, "Mom, will I be lonely in heaven?" Shouldn't happen to a kid. And here's the thing. I'm going to die. I hope not today or the week ahead. You're going to die. I hope not soon. But it's going to happen. And here is the good news. Because we have a shepherd. And he calls us by name. Noah, Wayne, and we will rise. And we will follow our shepherd. Because we hear his voice. And we know who he is. Pray with me. We love life, Lord. We love life because you are the God of life. We love life because we were made to live, not to die. And yet it happens, and we know it. But this too we know, that you are the shepherd, the good shepherd, the great shepherd, the chief shepherd. And you call us by name. And we follow you. Now and even beyond this life. And we thank you for that. Continue to guide us. In your name we ask it. Amen. When peace like a river